if you've ever heard the name Jamie Dimon.
I have not.
He's the CEO of JP Morgan.
All right, so you're already like ahead of where I thought you'd be. Let's talk about Rockstar CEOs. I think one of the biggest misconceptions amongst investors is that popular CEOs or CEOs with name brand recognition are going to deliver the most upside to shareholders. And in fact, often it works in the opposite way.
This guy's going to attack the SEC? How about removing him?
For a CEO to have reached a certain level of acclaim, that's probably because they've already grown a business to the point where everyone's heard of them. Usually, the bigger gains are going to come from a CEO that no one's ever heard of before. Someone who's working far away from the limelight and slowly building up the type of company that's going to contribute to huge shareholder wealth. When people think about CEOs, they think about people like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, people that are changing the world. And while that can lead to a lot of shareholder return, it's not always the case that those are going to be the best performing companies. Microsoft is a great example. Sure, they changed the world, and then for 10 years the share price did nothing. In the meantime, tons of nameless, faceless people came along, started companies, and drove up massive share price gains. Here's the thing with Steve Jobs. There's no question he was a visionary, but there's also no question that his first time running Apple didn't end with fireworks and roses. And actually, he had to be excommunicated from the company before he would then make a comeback and change the world all over again.
I'm pretty committed to this and seeing Apple turn around the company. I mean, I started the company with Steve Wozniak in my parents' garage, 20 years ago, and over 22 years ago. And so there's a definite place in my heart for this.
When Steve Jobs died in the fall of 2011, Apple had a market capitalization of about $300 billion. Since Tim Cook took over for Steve Jobs, Apple's market value more than tripled, from $300 billion up to about $1 trillion at its peak. Nobody would say that Tim Cook is more important to Apple's growth and Apple's innovation than Steve Jobs. So it's very tough to judge how much of a visionary the CEO is and then say that that's going to have some major impact on its share price. As Apple has grown its iPhone sales around the world, its services business, its watch, all of the things that Apple does, it's obvious that Tim Cook, as the CEO, is still benefiting from the legacy that Steve Jobs built while he was alive, while he was running the company. But despite this, the growth in market cap in both percentage terms and dollar terms under Tim Cook has been absolutely extraordinary. So where does Steve Jobs end and Tim Cook begin? I don't know that there's a quantitative answer to that question. Sometimes you can have the same company, but all it needs is a change at the top. Microsoft is a great example. Under Steve Ballmer, earnings grew, but the share price didn't for a very long time. Satya Nadella comes in as CEO, and yes, there was some change in the fundamentals of the company, but valuation exploded. Wall Street loved the new story, the new CEO, and the areas of expertise that he was bringing to the top job. So I walked around New York, where Jamie Dimon is a celebrity, to see how many people would recognize his name or Warren Buffett's name, and how few people would have any idea who's running MasterCard, who's running Visa, who's running Square or PayPal, or some of the fastest growing, best performing financial stocks. Have you ever heard the name Warren Buffett?
No.
Never. Have you ever heard the name Warren Buffett? Do you know who that is?
Of course I do.
Okay, who is that?
The fund. Why am I losing? I'm losing the name of the fund.
Berkshire Hathaway. All right, I know you knew that.
Yes.
Do you know who the CEO of Square is?
I've heard of it, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
no idea the
I
CEO?
don't know.
Do you know who the CEO is of MasterCard?
No
PayPal? Square?
No.
Not a lot of people know these either. In recent years, one of the most famous CEOs has also become one of the most notorious names in the news, and not always for a great reason. Elon Musk is the founder and CEO of Tesla Motors. Tesla had made shareholders a lot of money, and then over the last few years, there's been a stall in the share price, a lot of controversy, tweets that the regulators have taken issue with, a lot of statements that had to have been walked back.
Do you think you can work this out with the SEC over the next 2 weeks?
Most likely.
So while a lot of people are aware of Elon Musk, that hasn't necessarily been great for stockholders. Oftentimes, when a CEO becomes synonymous with their company, if the CEO has a scandal, the company won't escape, and vice versa. We've seen examples of this phenomenon over the years, and it rarely ends well for investors. The CEO of WorldCom had a scandal involving borrowing money from the company, and that company no longer exists. In the modern era, many technology companies have figured out a way to have their cake and eat it too. They get to be public companies with all of the market capitalization benefits that exist. They can use their shares as currency to make acquisitions, to pay highly valued employees, but they don't give up any votes. Facebook is in a situation where Mark Zuckerberg controls approximately 60% of all the voting rights of Facebook. So you have a choice. You can invest in the company, but you're investing in what Mark Zuckerberg wants to do. That could work in your favor or against your favor. And if there is a major scandal, it's hard to disassociate one from the other. The types of CEOs who end up on the news or in the mainstream media or on the cover of magazines are usually the people who have grown revenues the fastest, or who have innovated the most, or who have changed the world with their inventions, or have made huge mergers and acquisitions happen. But in reality, the CEOs who deserve the most credit are the ones who grow share price and build the most shareholder value. So I turned to a book called The Outsiders by William Thorndike that looks at 8 of the most unconventional CEOs and the biggest money makers for shareholders of all time. Mr. Thorndike wanted to take a look at these companies and these CEOs and find the common characteristics, what they did that was correct, and what they avoided doing that a lot of more popular CEOs perhaps spend too much time with. In The Outsiders, he looks at the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, which we all know is Warren Buffett, but then also his protege. He looks at Katharine Graham from the Washington Post. And one of the major things that stands out about the CEOs who are mentioned in The Outsiders is how little attention they pay to Wall Street analysts, the mainstream media, or the business press. These are people who do not do quarterly conference calls. These are people who do not seek out interviews or attention or publicity of any kind. When Katharine Graham's husband passed away, there were very few observers of the Washington Post who would have thought that she would be the one to lead the company going forward, especially given the fact that the Washington Post company was in the midst of working on an IPO to bring the shares public. Katharine Graham was more of a socialite and much less of a business person at the time this transfer happened, but in the end, she managed to find the right mentor to help her make the big decisions to make Washington Post not only a well-regarded newspaper, but a fabulously profitable and successful business. As an investor, you're not necessarily looking for famous name brand CEOs. What you're looking for are people who have a very strong sense of capital allocation, what to do with the free cash flow the company generates, and if they become famous in the process, that's not so terrible.
Invest in you. Ready, set, grow. CNBC and Acorns.